Hello, Dr. Ron England, and I'm going to talk to you today about objects and classes. And this is one of the basic lectures of C Sharp. But this is an important one because you really do need to understand how classes and objects work, what are objects, what are classes, how do they work together, and what are some of the things you can do with this. So right here on the screen, I've actually got a definition of a class. And the name of my class is Object Database Manager. Now, if you look at my class, you should be able to look at it and just from the name, Object Database Manager, know that what this class does is it must manage an object database. Right after the class declaration I have here, I also have some comments. Now, in the case of this class, it manages an object database, and it's very important to know what that object database looks like. So, I have actually the script of the table in SQL, this is SQL, that this Object Database Manager manages. So let's look a little bit at what is in this class, in this case, in this class. Well, the first thing I show here is I've actually got a method, okay, or also you can call it a function, okay, but what this does is it does something. Now, let's first look at the declaration here. I declared that this is public, meaning that other classes or other objects have the ability to call this method. And what this method returns is a SQL connection. It's an object of type SQL connection. This is a class type. SQL connection is a class type. The name of this function or method, I use both. I'm going to call them methods from here on out, but in this case it's a function because it returns something. But the name of it is connection, and it doesn't have any arguments. In other words, you don't have to pass anything to this method to get something back. And what it's going to return is a SQL connection, which is a type of a class. So what does it do? Well, what it actually does in this case, in this specific case, is it goes to the configuration manager, which is another object, and it looks inside of a web config file to find an object database, and then it returns a connection based on this object database connection string. So, but what actually occurs inside of here isn't really important to the fact that it's public, it's static, okay, it's a SQL connection is returned, and the name of the method is connection. Now, static. Static means that I don't actually have to instantiate the class to be able to call this method. In other words, I can call this method simply by saying Object Database Manager dot connection, and we're going to show that. Okay, let's look at some of these other ones. This manages a database, and so let's look at this. Let's look at another one called, this is another method, which is also public, which is also static, which answers a string, okay, and the name of this method is insert. Now notice in this case, this method actually requires an argument. The argument has got to be something of type IXML property object, and the name of that inside of the method will be O, this IXML property object. Well, just by looking at this, I know that IXML property object is an interface. It's actually not a full-fledged class, but it's a definition of a class interface. What this means is that any class that implements this interface can actually be passed in to this insert method. And what the thing actually does is it really basically creates an insert to the database and inserts the data into it. And notice here, I have a try catch, but in the try catch, I try to open the connection to the database, and if it actually works, I return data inserted, and if not, I return a message, which is the exception message. What's important here is that you can see that this is public static string. Those two return statements return a string, which is what you say that this method will return. So it's passed one thing, it returns something else. Well, I brought this up, so let's go out and look at what we mean by an interface. I have this here in the same part here is the definition of an interface. I have a public interface called IXML property object. Well, that should look awful familiar to you. It was the same thing that I passed into my object database manager for that insert. And notice it has some methods here, okay? Just like it had methods, but the methods don't do anything in this case. I also have some properties. What this says is that I must implement this method. I must implement these properties, and I must implement these methods to implement this interface. And I must implement this interface if I'm going to be used down here in this other object. So interfaces don't actually do anything other than say, this is what you must implement. Now, I do actually implement this here. If I come back up, I actually implement an object called XML property object, which then implements XML property object. The I is a standard nomenclature or standard way of denoting that this is an interface. And if you see here, I actually do implement those methods that the interface is required to implement. Okay. I also implement some of the things like, so here you see public string as XML. I actually do implement this as XML, which in the interface must be implemented because string as XML is defined as a required method. So what does this let me do? Now you've seen that I've got a class that you saw, which was Object Database Manager. You see another class, XML Property Object, which implements an interface. Now, in this case, it uses the exact same syntax as if I were going to also inherit from another object. Okay. Well, the truth of the matter is if I come down here, I actually have a class down here called Sample Properties Inherited, which then inherits from XML Property Object. By definition, XML Property Object will implement the interface XML Property Object, and because Sample Properties Inherited inherits from this object, it also implements the interface. Now in this case, I only do one thing in it, and that thing that I do is I define a property. Okay, let's go back up here to the first one, and let's talk a little bit about properties. Okay, properties are just that. Okay, a property is something that is inside the class. So this class has a property called ID, name, description, and owner. Those are values that are stored within the class itself. To store those values, I must instantiate the class. Properties to actually be used must be part of an instantiated class. In other words, I have to make an instance of this class. Okay, the instance of this class is called an object. Okay, I call an instance of a class an object. Okay, and the methods, which are functions that return things. Okay, in this case, you saw a previous function of the Object Database Manager, which was static. Static, to call a static class, you do not need to instantiate the class. Okay, they're also called class methods. But if I was to call the function or the method as XML, I actually do have to instantiate this class. I have to make an instance of this class to do it. And that instance of the class must also be given a name. Okay, I've also got one more thing that I'm going to show you here, which is in this case a constructor. Okay, a constructor is a property that is a special, is like a method. It's a special method in that it has the same exact name as the class. When I create the class, I can create it and I can call it a constructor. I actually have two constructors here, one that takes no arguments and one that takes a single argument called ID. Okay, polymorphism, which is the ability to use the same name, okay, but in this case with different arguments. When you create an instance of the class, if you create it with an instance of an ID, or create it by calling it with an ID, it's going to use this constructor. If you create it without that, it's going to do actually nothing, but it's going to use this constructor, which, by the way, does nothing. Okay, so What we've seen here is a lot of the basics of the concept of classes and objects. Okay, properties and methods are encapsulated within classes. Classes can implement a specific interface or can inherit from other classes. Classes can have methods, which can be methods that require instantiation of the class to call, meaning that you have to actually create an object, which is an instantiation of the class, and then you call it from the object. Or, okay, you can have static methods, which are called directly, we'll come down here, static methods, which are called directly by using the name of the class, dot, and the name of the method with the arguments that come over, and do not require an instantiation. Okay, this is a lot of really condensed information about classes, but this is the basics of what you have to know about object-oriented programming to be able to successfully work with and implement and use classes. Learn the naming conventions, learn what these things are called, okay, and this will be very helpful to you. Thank you very much, and good programming.